The neighbors of Pine Vista Estates could set their watches by Margaret Thornhill's daily rounds. Every afternoon at exactly 3 p.m., the 57-year-old woman with her short brown hair and reading glasses would begin her walk through the neighborhood. She carried her famous blue clipboard and wore comfortable shoes that barely made a sound as she crept up on unsuspecting rule breakers. "Your trash can is visible from the street," she'd say, catching Bill washing his car in the driveway. Or, "That garden gnome isn't on the approved decorations list," she'd tell Nancy, who had just placed a small ceramic figure by her roses. Everyone in Pine Vista had their own Margaret story. Behind her back, they called her HOA Karen, but nobody dared say it to her face. Margaret had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. Her husband had passed away early in their marriage, leaving her alone in the modest two-bedroom house at the end of Maple Street. Some neighbors thought maybe her strict enforcement of rules was just her way of staying busy or feeling important. Others simply avoided her completely. 4 inches, she'd say, measuring someone's grass with an actual ruler. The bylaws clearly state lawn height cannot exceed 3 inches. Then she'd write up the violation with a small smile on her face that made people's blood boil. Life in Pine Vista had fallen into this predictable pattern until one hot Tuesday in July when everything changed. Margaret stopped at the corner store on her way home from the grocery store. She bought her weekly lottery ticket, always the same numbers: 8, 17, 23, 42, 51, and 56, her wedding date and the birthdays of her parents. She'd been playing these numbers for 15 years without winning more than $20. That evening, while eating microwave lasagna and watching her favorite game show, Margaret lazily checked the lottery numbers on her phone. Her fork clattered to the floor. She checked again, and again. Her hands started shaking so badly she had to put the phone down. All 6 numbers matched. The jackpot was $3.2 million. At first, Margaret told no one. She called the lottery office the next morning, followed their instructions carefully, and hired a financial advisor who specialized in lottery winners. When the check finally cleared her bank account, she sat at her kitchen table and stared at the balance on her banking app for nearly an hour. $3,187,422.16, she whispered to herself. After taxes, it wasn't quite the full amount, but it was more money than she ever dreamed of having. For 3 nights straight, Margaret barely slept. She made lists of sensible things she should do with the money: pay off her mortgage, invest wisely, donate to the animal shelter. But one crazy idea kept popping into her head. One thing she'd never admit to anyone that she secretly wanted: a bright red Ferrari. Margaret had a car magazine hidden under her sensible cookbooks. The glossy pages showed the Ferrari 488 Spider from every angle: its sleek body, the leather interior, the powerful engine. For years, she'd looked at those pictures and imagined what it would be like to drive something so beautiful and powerful. 2 weeks after getting her money, Margaret walked into the Ferrari dealership wearing her best pantsuit. The salespeople ignored her at first. An older woman surely wasn't there to buy. But 3 hours later, she drove away in a brand-new $350,000 Ferrari 488 Spider, bright red with black leather seats. The look on people's faces when she drove slowly down Pine Vista's main street was worth every penny. Curtains twitched. People stopped walking their dogs to stare. Someone even dropped a garden hose that was still running. Margaret pulled into her driveway and stepped out of the low sports car, smoothing her pants and trying not to smile too widely. Her next-door neighbor Tom stood frozen on his lawn, mouth open in shock. "Is that yours?" he finally managed to ask. "Yes," Margaret said, patting the roof of the Ferrari. "I thought it was time for a change." She parked the gleaming car right in her driveway, not even trying to fit it in the garage where, according to her own strict enforcement, all vehicles were supposed to be stored. The Ferrari was too big to fit alongside her everyday sedan, and for the first time in 20 years, Margaret decided some rules could be bent, at least for herself. For the first few days after bringing home her Ferrari, Margaret Thornhill was almost nice to her neighbors. She smiled and waved when people stared at her car. She even let Mrs. Wilson's grandson sit in the driver's seat and pretend to steer. But the honeymoon period didn't last long. By the second week, the old Margaret started coming back, but worse. Now she had two personalities, sweet and understanding about her own rule-breaking and stricter than ever about everyone else's. The Ferrari never went into the garage. It sat in her driveway day and night, shining under the streetlights. Sometimes when Margaret was in a hurry, she parked it halfway on the sidewalk. Once, she even left it parked at an angle, taking up part of her neighbor's driveway entrance. "Sorry about that," she said with a little laugh when Tom mentioned it. "This beauty needs space." Then she patted the car like it was a pet. That same afternoon, Margaret wrote up 3 different neighbors for parking violations. Frank Lee, who fixed air conditioners for a living, got a notice on his work van. He'd parked it in his driveway overnight because his son had friends sleeping over, and the extra cars took up the garage and street parking. Third violation this year, Margaret had written in her perfect handwriting. Commercial vehicles must be stored off-site or in garages out of view. Fine, $75. Frank crumpled up the notice. 2 years earlier, he'd fixed Margaret's AC in the middle of a heat wave for a discounted price because she complained about being on a fixed income. "And now look at her," he told his wife while they watched Margaret zoom down the street in her red sports car. "Suddenly the rules don't apply when you're rich." At the monthly HOA meeting, attendance was double the usual number. People were curious about the lottery winner in their midst, but they were also angry. Lisa Rivera stood up during the open comments section. Last summer, she'd asked permission to park her RV in her driveway for one weekend while she packed it for a family vacation. Margaret had shot down her request immediately. "The bylaws are very clear," Margaret had said back then. "No recreational vehicles visible from the street, no exceptions." Now Lisa held up her phone, showing everyone a picture of Margaret's Ferrari parked halfway on the grass. "I thought we weren't allowed to park on the lawn," Lisa asked, her voice shaking a little with nerves. "Isn't that in the bylaws too?" Margaret straightened up in her chair at the front table. As HOA vice president, she sat with the other board members facing the residents. "That's completely different," she said firmly. "My Ferrari is an investment vehicle, not some camping trailer." She waved her hand dismissively. "And anyway, it was only for a few minutes while I unloaded groceries." "It was there for 3 hours," Lisa said. "I took time-stamped photos." Margaret's face flushed red. "Well, I'm proposing a change to our bylaws." She slid papers across the table to the other board members. "I've drafted an amendment to allow exceptions for luxury vehicles of significant value. They enhance our neighborhood's prestige." The room erupted in angry murmurs. Jerry Thompson, who'd lived in Pine Vista for 30 years, stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. "So the rules only apply to regular folks now?" he asked. "That doesn't seem right, Margaret." Instead of backing down, Margaret doubled down. The day after the heated meeting, she went on her afternoon patrol with renewed energy. She wrote up 6 violations before dinner, a record even for her. Mrs. Patel got a notice for her son's bicycle left on the front porch. The Johnsons were cited for their trash can being visible from the side street. Even old Mr. Peterson, who could barely bend down anymore, got a violation for not picking up leaves fast enough. Meanwhile, Margaret's Ferrari collected dust on her custom parking pad that definitely wasn't approved by the architectural committee. The neighbors of Pine Vista Estates watched in disbelief as the woman who had terrorized them for years with her clipboard now flouted every rule she'd ever enforced. When they saw her red Ferrari coming down the street, they turned away, the rumbling engine a constant reminder that in Margaret's world, there were now 2 sets of rules, one for her and one for everyone else. By the 3rd month of Ferrari ownership, Margaret had crossed a line that even she couldn't talk her way around. One Saturday morning, residents of Pine Vista woke up to the sound of construction equipment in Margaret's front yard. Without asking permission from anyone, she had hired workers to build a fancy cobblestone parking pad next to her driveway, specially designed for her Ferrari. "It's Italian stone," she told anyone who stopped to look. "Imported from the same region where they make the cars. It cost almost as much as some people's actual cars." She laughed at her own joke while the neighbors exchanged glances. The parking pad was beautiful, with smooth stones arranged in a pattern that matched the red of the Ferrari. It had special lighting installed around the edges that lit up at night, creating a spotlight effect on the car. It looked like something from a luxury car showroom, not a suburban neighborhood where the biggest rule was that nothing could be built without HOA approval. For 3 days, nobody from the HOA board said anything. People wondered if Margaret's money had somehow bought everyone's silence. Then on Wednesday morning, a knock came at Margaret's door. It was Dave Wilson, the HOA president. At 65, Dave was a retired high school principal who had lived in Pine Vista longer than anyone. He was known for being fair and calm, the kind of guy who could break up a fight between teenagers without raising his voice. Everyone respected Dave, even Margaret, at least until now. "Morning, Margaret," he said, holding a piece of paper. "I need to talk to you about this cobblestone area you've installed." Margaret's smile disappeared. "What about it?" "Well, as you know, any exterior changes need board approval first. There was no application submitted for this project." His voice was gentle but firm. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Dave, it's just a parking pad. It makes the neighborhood look better, not worse." Dave handed her the paper, an official violation notice, the first Margaret had ever received in her 15 years at Pine Vista. "This isn't personal," he said. "The same rules apply to everyone. You need to either submit the proper paperwork retroactively, which the board may or may not approve, or remove the structure within 30 days. Margaret stared at the violation notice, her face turning almost as red as her car. Then she did something that shocked Dave so much he took a step back. She ripped the notice in half, then in quarters. "How dare you?" she shouted, poking her finger into Dave's chest. "After everything I've done for this neighborhood. 15 years on the board, thousands of hours walking around in the hot sun and pouring rain, keeping this place from turning into a trailer park. And this is the thanks I get." Dave tried to calm her down. "Margaret, please." "Get off my property," she hissed. "And you can tell the rest of the board they can kiss my cobblestones." She slammed the door so hard that her own "Bless This Home" sign fell off the wall inside. By lunchtime, everyone in Pine Vista had heard about the confrontation. The story grew with each retelling, with some versions claiming Margaret had thrown a potted plant at Dave. She hadn't. Or that she'd threatened to run him over with her Ferrari. Also not true, though she'd thought about it. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Usually only about 15 people showed up. This time, more than 50 residents packed into the community center meeting room. People brought folding chairs from home when the regular chairs ran out. Some even stood along the back wall. Margaret arrived 10 minutes late, making a grand entrance in a new designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. She took her usual seat at the front table with the other board members, ignoring the whispers and stares. Dave called the meeting to order and tried to start with regular business, but Mike Gonzalez, who lived across from Margaret, stood up immediately. "I think we need to discuss the cobblestone elephant in the room," he said. Several people nodded in agreement. "If you're referring to my parking pad," Margaret cut in, "I've reconsidered and I'll be submitting the proper paperwork tomorrow." "That's not good enough," Lisa Rivera said, standing up. "Anyone else would have to remove it and then apply. Why should you get special treatment?" Voices rose in agreement. For the first time, Margaret looked uncertain as she faced a room full of neighbors who were no longer intimidated by her clipboard or her rules. And in the back of her mind, a tiny voice was whispering that maybe, just maybe, she had pushed things too far. 4 months into the Ferrari saga, Mother Nature decided to join the neighborhood drama. A summer storm hit Pine Vista Estates with unexpected fury. Rain pounded against windows, lightning flashed across the sky, and wind howled through the trees. Margaret sat in her living room, watching the Weather Channel with growing concern. She'd covered her precious Ferrari with a custom car cover that had cost almost $1,000, but she still worried about hail damage. Around midnight, a loud crack split the air. Margaret jumped up and peeked through her curtains just in time to see a massive branch from her prized oak tree come crashing down. The same oak tree that Dave and others on the landscaping committee had warned her about 3 times last year. "It needs proper trimming, Margaret," Dave had told her. "Those branches are getting too heavy." "That tree has been fine for 20 years, she'd replied. "I'm not wasting money on tree trimmers who just want to scare people." Now the enormous branch had missed her Ferrari by inches but completely blocked her driveway. It was too big for her to move alone, and at midnight in a storm, there was no chance of getting help until morning. Margaret went back to bed, taking a sleeping pill to calm her nerves. She'd deal with everything tomorrow. When she woke up the next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom window as she stretched and thought about her plans for the day. First, she'd need to call someone about that branch. Then maybe she'd drive her Ferrari to that new shopping center 30 miles away. She'd heard they had a French cafe that served amazing pastries. She took her time getting ready, applying her makeup carefully and choosing a stylish outfit. It was nearly 10 a.m. when she finally made her way downstairs and looked out the front window. The branch still blocked her driveway where her everyday sedan was parked in the garage. But something was wrong. Something was missing. Her Ferrari was gone. Margaret blinked hard, as if the car might magically reappear. She rushed outside in her slippers, looking around wildly. The custom car cover lay crumpled on the edge of her cobblestone pad, but the Ferrari itself had vanished. "My car," she shrieked, her voice echoing down the quiet street. "Someone stole my car." Mrs. Henderson, who was walking her little dog, stopped at the edge of Margaret's yard. "Everything okay?" she called. "My Ferrari. It's been stolen." Margaret was already pulling out her phone to call the police. "Call 911. She shouted at Mrs. Henderson, who just kept walking, pretending not to hear. Officer Pete Douglas arrived 20 minutes later, notebook in hand. He was young, maybe 30, with a patient expression that suggested he'd seen it all. "So your vehicle was parked here last night?" He pointed to the cobblestone pad. "Yes, under the cover. I went to bed during the storm, and when I woke up, it was gone. Someone stole it right from my driveway." Margaret's voice rose higher with each word. Officer Douglas walked around, making notes. He paused when he reached the street in front of Margaret's house. "Ma'am, was your car parked in the driveway or on the street last night?" "In the driveway, of course," Margaret said. Then she remembered. With the fallen branch blocking her driveway, she'd moved the Ferrari to the street before going to bed. "Well, actually, because of the branch, I had to park on the street, just temporarily." Officer Douglas nodded and pointed to a sign at the end of Margaret's front yard. The sign that Margaret herself had demanded the HOA install 5 years ago. "No OVERNIGHC parking. 7:00 p.m., 7:00 a.m. Violators WLBTOBED Pine Vista Estates HOA." "Oh, that doesn't apply to residents," Margaret said quickly. "That's just for visitors." Officer Douglas checked his notes. "According to city records, this is a blanket restriction for all vehicles. No exceptions noted." He looked up. "I believe your car was legally towed, Ms. Thornhill." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Towed? My Ferrari was towed." "I can check the records," Officer Douglas said, walking back to his patrol car. He spoke into his radio, waited, then returned to Margaret with a sympathetic expression. "Your vehicle was towed at 6:42 this morning by Jim's Towing. Apparently, one of your neighbors called it in." Margaret's face turned as red as her missing car. A horrible thought struck her. She looked across the street where Franklin was watering his flowers, deliberately not looking in her direction. 2 houses down, Lisa Rivera was getting her mail, a small smile on her face. "Who called?" Margaret demanded. "Which neighbor reported me?" Officer Douglas shook his head. "That information isn't provided. You'll need to contact Jim's Towing to retrieve your vehicle. They're located on Industrial Drive. I'd suggest calling first about their fees." As the officer drove away, Margaret stood frozen on her lawn, the irony of the situation slowly sinking in. Her Ferrari, her precious baby, had been towed because of the very rule she had created and enforced with an iron fist for years. And somewhere in Pine Vista Estates, someone was laughing. Margaret didn't even change out of her slippers. She grabbed her purse, jumped into her everyday sedan, and drove straight to Jim's Towing and Recovery on the outskirts of town. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. All she could think about was her beautiful Ferrari sitting in some dirty impound lot. Jim's Towing was a fenced yard with a small office building made of metal siding. The parking lot was unpaved gravel that crunched under Margaret's slippers as she hurried toward the entrance. A bell jingled as she pushed open the door. Behind a cluttered desk sat a middle-aged man with a bushy mustache and a baseball cap. The name tag on his shirt read Jim. He glanced up as Margaret stormed in. "I'm here for my car," she announced, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. A red Ferrari that was illegally taken from my property this morning. Jim looked at her calmly. Name? Margaret Thornhill from Pine Vista Estates. Jim typed something into an ancient computer. Yep, got it here. Ferrari 488, red, towed at 6:42 a.m. for violation of overnight parking restrictions on a residential street. He turned the screen so she could see the digital form with her car's details. That'll be $345. $345? Margaret gasped. That's highway robbery. Jim shrugged. Standard towing fee is $150. There's an additional fee for specialty vehicles that require extra care. Plus the after-hours service charge since it was before our regular business hours, and there's already 1 day of storage at $95. Margaret fumbled in her purse for her credit card. This is outrageous. I'll be reporting this to the Better Business Bureau. Feel free, Jim said, taking her card. But our rates are registered with the city and posted right there. He pointed to a laminated sign on the wall. We have a contract with your HOA. Margaret's face flushed as she remembered signing that very contract 3 years ago. The board had gone with Jim's towing because they were the cheapest option, even though Dave had suggested using a company with better equipment. Just give me back my car, she snapped. Jim handed her a clipboard with forms to sign. It's in the back lot. I'll have Bobby drive you back there. A young man in oil-stained coveralls appeared from a side door. This way, ma'am. Margaret followed Bobby through the gravel lot, her slippers now dusty and ruined. They turned a corner around a stack of old tires, and there it was, her beautiful Ferrari. Except it didn't look so beautiful anymore. The front end was noticeably lower than it should be. What happened to my car? She shrieked, running toward it. Bobby scratched his head. Well, these super low sports cars are tricky to tow. The front splitter thing scraped a bit when we loaded it. These cars aren't really made for regular towing, you know. The carbon fiber front splitter, a special aerodynamic piece that alone cost $7,000, was cracked and scraped. Margaret felt like she might faint. You damaged my car. Who's going to pay for this? Bobby handed her another form from his pocket. It's all in the paperwork you just signed, ma'am. Section 4, paragraph 2 states that the towing company is not liable for damage to vehicles that are in violation of parking ordinances. It's in the HOA contract too. Margaret snatched the paper from him and read the fine print. Her own signature was at the bottom of the page, dated 3 years earlier. I want to speak to Jim again, she said through clenched teeth. Back in the office, Jim was unmoved by her complaints. Sorry about the damage, but that's why we charge extra for specialty vehicles. They're not made for towing. Maybe don't park a car like that where it might get towed. I'll sue you, Margaret threatened. I'll sue your whole company. Jim leaned back in his chair. You can try, but the contract's pretty clear. By the way, your HOA board approved it unanimously. He squinted at her. Wait a minute. Thornhill, aren't you on that board? Margaret's mouth snapped shut. She was trapped in a web of her own making. I'm taking my car, she finally said, and I'll be back with my lawyer. Jim nodded. That's your right. But until then, it's $345 to release the vehicle. And just so you know, storage fees keep adding up until you take it. Tomorrow will be another $95. Margaret slammed her credit card down on the counter. As she waited for the transaction to process, she noticed a familiar face in a photo on the wall, Jim standing next to Frank Lee from her neighborhood. You know Frank? She asked, pointing at the picture. Jim nodded. High school buddies. He's the one who recommended my company to your HOA 3 years ago. He handed back a credit card with a receipt. Small world, isn't it? Margaret felt the walls closing in. Frank had called in the towel. It had to be him. And now his friend Jim had her Ferrari with its damaged front end, and there was nothing she could legally do about it. As she climbed into the Ferrari, she noticed a small parking ticket tucked under the wiper blade, issued by the city, not the HOA. Another $75 she would have to pay. Her perfect day of pastries at the French cafe was ruined. Her perfect car was damaged. And for the first time in years, Margaret Thornhill drove home well under the speed limit, wondering just how many enemies she had made in Pine Vista Estates. 6 weeks passed, and Margaret's Ferrari remained at Jim's towing. What had started as a $345 fee had now ballooned to over $5,000 with daily storage charges. Margaret had visited 3 different lawyers, each one giving her the same bad news. Legally, she didn't have a case. The towing had followed proper procedures based on rules that she herself had helped create and enforce. To make matters worse, the Ferrari dealership 2 hours away had quoted $12,000 to repair the damaged front splitter. It's carbon fiber, the service manager had explained. Custom made for this specific model. Plus, we'll need to repaint and make sure the aerodynamics are perfect. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at her bank statement. Her lottery winnings had seemed endless at first, but they weren't. She'd already spent nearly $1 million in just 4 months. The Ferrari, a closet full of designer clothes, a planned kitchen renovation, and some risky investments her financial advisor had warned against. Paying another $17,000 for the towing fees and car repairs felt like admitting defeat. She couldn't do it. There had to be another way. That night, she saw a news story about a woman who had organized a protest when her insurance company wouldn't pay for her roof damage. The protest had worked. The company eventually gave in after the bad publicity. That's it, Margaret whispered to herself. I'll make this public. The next morning, she called every local news station. She told them about a poor lottery winner whose dream car had been unfairly towed and damaged. Only one station showed any interest, Channel 8, the smallest local station with the lowest ratings. On Thursday afternoon, a young reporter named Brenda showed up at Margaret's house with a cameraman. Margaret had dressed carefully in her most conservative outfit, trying to look like a sweet, ronde grandmother rather than the neighborhood rule enforcer everyone knew her to be. I just want my car back, Margaret told Brenda, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. They're charging me over $5,000 now, and they damaged my car when they towed it. It's not right. The interview went well. Margaret thought she came across as sympathetic and reasonable. The story aired that night as a small segment on the local news, Lottery Winner's Dream Car Nightmare. What Margaret hadn't counted on was social media. By the next morning, the story had been shared hundreds of times, but not in the way she'd hoped. People from Pine Vista Estates had seen the segment and were commenting with their own HOA Karen stories. This is the same woman who fined me $100 because my trash can was visible from the street during a hurricane, wrote one neighbor. She gave me a violation notice the day after my husband's funeral because our lawn wasn't mowed, added another. The Channel 8 news team, seeing the unexpected reaction, decided to do a follow-up story. This time, they interviewed several Pine Vista residents, including Frank, Lisa, and Dave from the HOA board. The irony is that Margaret created those very parking rules, Dave explained on camera. She's enforced them ruthlessly against others for years. Now she's upset that they apply to her too. The follow-up piece aired with the title, Rule Enforcer Becomes Rule Breaker. Margaret watched in horror as her neighbors shared stories about her years of strict enforcement. The segment ended with a shot of the empty cobblestone parking pad where her Ferrari used to sit. Social media erupted again, this time with the hashtag HOA Karen trending locally. People from all over town were sharing their own story about unreasonable HOA rules. Margaret's name and face were everywhere. Humiliated and desperate, Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting. Her plan was simple: convince the board to use the HOA's reserve funds to pay the towing fees and repair costs as a neighborhood goodwill gesture. The community center was packed again. Margaret had prepared a careful speech about forgiveness and community spirit. She even wore the same conservative outfit from the TV interview. Friends and neighbors, she began, standing at the podium. I think we all agree that what happened with my car has created unnecessary division in our community. In the spirit of moving forward together, I propose that the HOA use a small portion of our reserve fund, just $17,000, to resolve this unfortunate situation. This would be a gesture of goodwill that would help heal our neighborhood. The room was completely silent for a long moment. Then Dave stood up. Let me make sure I understand, he said slowly. You want to use HOA funds, money collected from every household in Pine Vista, to pay for your personal vehicle expenses. Margaret nodded. As a one-time exception, for community harmony. Dave looked around the room. I think we should vote on this. All in favor of using HOA funds to pay for Margaret's towing fees and car repairs, raise your hand. Not a single hand went up, not even from people who had previously supported Margaret on the board. All opposed. Every hand in the room shot up. Margaret stood frozen at the podium, her last hope crushed by a unanimous vote. There was nothing left to do but pay the growing fees herself and face the reality that her actions had finally caught up with her. As she walked to her car alone, she heard someone whisper, "Calm as a Ferrari, isn't it?" After the crushing defeat at the HOA meeting, Margaret went home and poured herself a large glass of wine. She sat in her living room, looking out at the empty cobblestone parking pad that had started all this trouble. The space looked sad and abandoned without the gleaming red Ferrari. The next morning, Margaret called her bank and arranged for a cashier's check to cover the full amount owed to Jim's towing, $7,235. The number made her wince. All that money just to get her car back, and then she'd still need to pay for repairs. She dressed carefully, as if putting on armor for battle, and drove to the bank. The teller who handed her the cashier's check gave her a pitying look. News travels fast in small towns, and everyone seemed to know about #HOA Karen and her Ferrari troubles. When Margaret pulled into Jim's towing an hour later, she held her head high despite her churning stomach. She'd get her car back, fix it up, and eventually this whole mess would be forgotten. Life would return to normal. Jim wasn't at the desk this time. A young woman greeted Margaret with professional politeness. "I'm here to pay the fees and retrieve my Ferrari," Margaret said, sliding the cashier's check across the counter. "It's been here for nearly 7 weeks." The woman typed into the computer, then made a phone call. "Bobby will take you back to see the vehicle before processing the payment," she explained. Margaret followed Bobby across the gravel lot, this time wearing proper shoes. When they rounded the corner to where her Ferrari was kept, she stopped short and gasped. Her once beautiful car looked nothing like she remembered. The formerly gleaming red paint was dulled with a layer of dust and grime. Leaves had collected around the windshield wipers, but that wasn't the worst of it. "Ma'am, we need to discuss the condition of your vehicle," Bobby said awkwardly. "When we moved it to make space last week, we found some issues." He pointed to the driver's side window, which was cracked open about an inch. "That window's been like that the whole time. We didn't notice at first." Margaret's heart sank. She remembered now, the night of the storm, she'd cracked the window slightly before covering the car, worried about humidity building up under the car cover. Bobby continued, "With that window open, we had some problems." He opened the driver's door to reveal the once pristine leather interior. The cream-colored seats were stained with water spots. Worse, there were tiny droppings and chewed bits of material on the floor. "Mice," Bobby explained. "They got in through the window, made themselves at home. Chewed up some of the wiring too. The car won't start now." Margaret felt dizzy. She reached out to steady herself against the car's roof. "But this can't, you should have." "We sent you a certified letter after the first month," Bobby said, pulling out a clipboard with a copy. "It says right here we're not responsible for acts of nature or pre-existing conditions. You signed this when you approved our contract with the HOA 3 years ago." Margaret took the clipboard with trembling hands. There was her signature, right at the bottom. Back in the office, Jim had arrived. He looked genuinely sorry when Bobby explained the situation. "I can recommend a good body shop," Jim offered. "They might be able to help with the cosmetic damage. But for the wiring and engine work, you'll need the Ferrari dealer." Margaret called the Ferrari dealership from Jim's office. The service manager listened to her description of the damage and let out a low whistle. "Rodent damage to the wiring harness can be very extensive," he explained. "Add in water damage to the interior and electrical systems. We're probably looking at $60,000 minimum, maybe more." $60,000? Margaret's voice came out as a squeak. "These are specialized components, ma'am. And once rodents get into a wiring system, they rarely chew just one wire." Margaret's insurance would only cover a fraction of the cost. She'd chosen a high-deductible policy to keep her monthly payments low, never imagining something like this would happen. She paid Jim the $7,235, making him promise to keep the Ferrari safe until she could arrange for a flatbed truck to transport it to the dealership for a proper assessment. But when the estimate came back at $68,400, Margaret made the hardest decision of her life. She sold the damaged Ferrari to a specialty salvage company for just $42,000, less than half what she paid for it 4 months earlier. The day the salvage company came to take away the Ferrari, several neighbors gathered at a respectful distance to watch. There was no cheering or celebration, just quiet observation as the flatbed truck loaded up the dusty red sports car and drove away. 2 weeks later, Margaret put her house up for sale. She'd found a small condo in the next town over, a place where nobody knew about #HOA Karen or her Ferrari disaster. On her last day in Pine Vista, Dave Wilson came by with a small gift bag. "The board wanted you to have this," he said, handing it to Margaret. No hard feelings. Inside was a small model of a red Ferrari with a tiny parking ticket attached to the windshield. At the bottom of the gift bag was a card signed by all the board members. "Rules are for everyone. Drive safely in your new community." Margaret surprised herself by laughing. For the first time, she could see the humor in what had happened, the perfect cosmic justice of it all. 6 months later, the Pine Vista Estates HOA revised their rulebook. On the cover page was a new title, The Margaret Guidelines. Underneath, in smaller print, it read, "Rules apply to everyone equally, no matter what they drive." And somewhere across town, Margaret drove her sensible sedan exactly at the speed limit, always careful now to park it precisely according to every posted sign.